Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I'm David Corey. I'm director of Baylor in Washington, D.C., and we have a panel event this evening on economic inequality. In fact, we've titled it The Inequality Gap, Asking the Right Questions. And I would like to introduce our two panelists for this evening. We have Ramesh Ponnuru, who's an American conservative journalist. He's a visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, has been since 2012, and a senior editor for National Review. He's also a columnist for Bloomberg View and a contributing editor to the Domestic Policy National Affairs, which is now run out of AEI. We also have David Madland, a senior fellow, and he's a senior fellow at CAP, Center for American Progress, and a senior advisor to the American Worker Project at American Progress. He's written extensively about the economy and American politics, and especially economic inequality, as well as retirement policy, labor unions, workplace standards such as the minimum wage. Thank you both for joining us. Thanks. I want to also say a word of thanks to our co-sponsor tonight, which is the Institute for Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America. I'd especially like to thank Joe Capizzi and Stephen Higgins. We've collaborated with IHE before, but we're always grateful when they come alongside and support us. So this is a joint venture here. I want to start by saying I'm no expert on economics in general and not on inequality in particular. I teach political philosophy at Baylor University, but I think I'm probably like so many American citizens who want to have a clearer understanding of what's going on with inequality and what the policy options might look like. And I want to say before we get started, just to be clear and to be fair to the panelists, this is going to be an unrehearsed conversation. I have not sent them these questions that I'm going to ask in advance. They have no idea what they're about to be asked, except that I'm going to talk about inequality. So if they fumble or maybe want to circle back around and change their mind, I think that's perfectly fine. I don't expect that we'll have a ready answer to every question that I'm asked, but they're going to be good sports and try to see what they can do for us. And so let me just frame the question a little bit. Inequality is such a vast topic. I want to make sure it's clear what we're talking about and what we're not talking about. We can in the future, and I hope we will in the future, discuss economic inequality, say across genders and races and age groups. Those are all really interesting questions and I think very important, but we're not focusing on that tonight. We're talking specifically about the gap between the best off and the worst off in America. So the gap of economic income or wealth between the best off and the worst off. And perhaps comparatively, if we want to get into this, we can consider that gap worldwide, see how America compares to other countries. And I also want to distinguish what we're talking about from the problem of poverty, though these issues are obviously interrelated and they overlap to some degree. Baylor cares very deeply about poverty, and we've done work on poverty and hunger. But while poverty and inequality are related, it's possible to differentiate them, and I think it's important that we do, in part because the latest numbers that have come in over the past month show that the poverty rate in America for 2019 was down again. It's now at 10.5%. I'm sure COVID will change this, but the numbers from 2019 are at 10.5%. And I would point out that that's an all-time low since measurements began in 1959. So poverty is decreasing in America, and yet we might still, and I'll ask the panelists to help us understand what these numbers might look like, but we could still, even with much lower poverty, have enormous inequality, so that inequality is an independent problem from the poverty problem. And the way that can work is that if the worst off in America are very, very far from the best off, but they're not poor, right? They're not actually under the poverty rate, that you can see how we can disentangle those two things. And I just want us to focus on inequality tonight. We're welcome to talk about poverty, but it's just not our main focus. That's the issue I want us to talk about. Let me start by I've got a few questions and they're in a sort of logical order, but I've invited the panelists to weigh in when they want to, interrupting me if that's what they want to do, that's fine. But let me just get us started with, I think, the factual question that is most important for this conversation, which is, how can we know what the economic gap, the inequality gap is? How's it measured? I've been in conversation with Michael Strain over at AEI, and he says by his measures, it's actually currently decreasing, the gap between the best off and the worst off. Maybe you agree with that, or maybe you don't. Let me just ask you both how you see, how do we measure this, and where are we with respect to economic inequality? David, would you start?
I think you're muted, David.
Yeah.
There we go. Now I'm unmuted now. But I was going to say thanks to David and to Baylor and to Catholic for this opportunity. I appreciate it. So how do we think about inequality? Sort of what's the data show and what data are we looking at? There's, you can look at income data where we have, government recorded data on incomes over and wages over a quite long period of time. We've had a harder time until recently getting sort of the very top income data, because there's sort of so few at the very, very top that had to get academics like Piketty and Saez to sort of look back at tax records to sort of unearth that. And what I think the data show is that sort of at the very, very top, there's been a huge increase in the amount of income those people have over the past 4+ decades, so that in American history, we're now basically at all-time highs, or roughly near all-time highs, of where we used to be, with the share of income that the very top have are about where they were in the 1920s. That's at the same time, for most people in the middle, their incomes have been largely stagnant. Now, there is some modest debate, but we can have about sort of how much, but I think it's been largely flat for the typical worker, for the median worker, basically flat. And certainly when you compare what the median worker had done in the 40 years prior, so like the 1940s to the 1970s, most all workers did well there. Over that period of time, most workers' incomes doubled. Over the last 40 years, most workers have had very little gains at the median, some more at the top, and we can have a little debate about, I think Ramesh might say a little bit more, but I think the general story I'm saying of the vast majority of the gains going to the very top and not that much going to most people in the middle, I think is pretty universally accepted, but I'm interested and open to the debate about where we go from here.
Let me hear from Ramesh.
Here I am, also unmuted. See, we're having a debate where nobody is silenced. So there are a variety of ways of measuring economic inequality, and it depends on sort of what you're interested in, why you're interested in inequality, which measure you use. I think one good measure, although it's only as good as the underlying data, of course, is called the Gini coefficient. And the way you construct that is, think sort of like the person at the 10th percentile of income, how much of the country's income does that person have, and so on. And that if you have perfect equality, that's a 45-degree line. But you measure out inequality based on how much area there is between the curve and that straight diagonal line. Now, I agree with David that the big picture on that kind of inequality is that it has increased substantially from, let's say, the late 1970s to today. However, the Congressional Budget Office suggests that it peaked around 2007. And their most recent estimate of it had it actually having dropped a little bit to the level it was in the early 2000s. But all this is a little bit dated, and it's going to take a while for us to have the answer to that. So I think we've got at least a long-term trend of rising economic inequality. We have higher wealth inequality than income inequality, which is probably what you would expect. So on the question of sort of how the person in the middle has done, here I think I have some differences, or at least differences of emphasis with David. I think there's no question that economic growth in general has been smaller over the last few decades, or slower over the last few decades than it had been in the immediate post-World War II period. And because you've got more inequality, applied to that growth, it is true that your person in the middle has seen their income grow at a slower rate than, say, from 1980 to 2020 than they did from 1950 to 1980, let's say. But I think there has still been significant growth in the economic welfare of middle income workers. And that's particularly true when you include things like benefits and not just wages, because non-wage benefits like healthcare have been an increasing proportion of compensation. Now, maybe in a way, maybe that's not an entirely good thing. Maybe we should have a system which gives people more wages and they can buy benefits themselves. But I think if you're thinking about just the pure economic welfare of somebody in the middle of the income spectrum, you do need to count those non-wage benefits. And the story that it tells you is you had periods of stagnation. So 2001 to 2015 is not a particularly great period, but 1980 to 1999 is a pretty good period, and 2015 until the beginning of the pandemic is also a pretty good period where we've seen real gains.
That's interesting because obviously the question of gains in the income of the middle class is separate from inequality, because if those gains are being way outstripped by the gains in the upper class, then we still have the inequality problem. I want to shift, you knew it was coming, to a sort of more normative footing. We just worked on looking at some of the facts and minor disagreements as far as I'm concerned, because both of you acknowledge that inequality is quite significant in America. And as somebody who teaches political philosophy, this is a problem that is noted as far back as Plato's Republic, and Aristotle in his Politics recommends, as did Plato in the Republic, that rulers keep their eye on the inequality between the rich and the poor, lest you find you have two cities instead of one. And Hobbes, famously in the Leviathan, assigns among the minimal duties that a ruler has one is to watch for inequality. Now, probably for all of them, the reason they cared was that negative consequences that might come to the city because of inequality. But it seems to me there might be other reasons we could be concerned. So here's the simple question: is why do we need it, or do we need to care about inequality? Is it an intrinsic bad? I've never got a good defense that it is, or is it bad in some kind of consequentialist way? It's bad for certain things it brings about.
Ramesh, you want to start?
Sure. So my answer to that is that inequality is not per se a bad thing, or at least not that bad a thing. It should be low on our list of priorities to be concerned about. It is less important that the ratio of the income of the top 10% and the bottom 10% go down than it is that we have reduction in poverty. That is, that the absolute welfare of people at the bottom rises, or than that the absolute value of the welfare of people in the middle rises. I think broad-based prosperity is important, but inequality per se isn't. So it's important to keep in mind, I'm not just saying like it's fine to have a society where the average is going up because one guy is getting fabulously wealthy and everybody else is getting poorer. But I think if you have broad-based prosperity, then I don't think that this question of the ratios, how's the person in the 90th percentile doing compared to the person in the middle or compared to the person at the bottom, is particularly important in itself. Then you do, as you were suggesting, get into other consequentialist questions. So then what you'd want to know is, does higher inequality, again, of itself, not talking about poverty, not talking about stagnation in the middle, is it associated with various outcomes? And there's a very, very extensive social science literature on what it does to politics, what it does to public health, whether the fact that you have a more unequal society means that you'll have a more stagnant society. All of those are sort of second order reasons to be concerned about inequality. I myself, and David may disagree with me on this, I find this literature generally extremely unconvincing. I think of the work of Lane Kenworthy, who's a social democrat who would like to have a much bigger government that does a lot more including to fight poverty. And his review of that literature says, no, no, inequality per se does not increase obesity, does not decrease confidence in government, does not, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so because I don't find the consequentialist arguments particularly compelling, at least at our level of inequality or anything close to our level of inequality, and I don't think it is in itself that important, I do think that it's a mistake to focus too much on it.
Let me hear your thoughts, David.
Yeah, so I think at extreme levels, which I think the United States is at extreme levels of inequality, it's a big concern. And it's a big concern to me in large part because of the impact it has on things that affect all of us. So it has a huge effect on the quality of our democracy. As you mentioned, the folks from Aristotle have been worried that a society that's made up of rich and poor without much of a middle will degenerate into the types of infighting that weaken and destroy societies. And I think we are starting to see significant signs of that in the United States. Another big concern of mine is, and this is related to the governance, but it's a broader social concern, is that as inequality gets higher, people pull apart and sort of live different lives. And one of the things that leads to is lower levels of trust in society, that you don't think other people are like you. You don't think that they're going to do the right thing. And that makes basic social interactions, from business decisions to negotiations to political decisions, much harder. And so you have more polarized society and more fighting that doesn't lead to productive results for anyone. And I'm happy to talk about the evidence for this. Now, Ramesh at some level is right. This is social science. There's never going to be a perfect, pure demonstration. We can't just, put our things in a beaker and say, oh, we have inequality here, and then this is proof. But I'm happy to talk in detail about why I think the evidence really is pretty strong on, especially those factors that inequality really does lead to these pretty bad outcomes for society.
Yeah, those are outcomes that I've thought about too. I mean, distortions in political power is something. Outcomes in social trust in particular seems very serious, because social trust is a kind of way of getting things done by people whom you know and you can trust. That all sounds very important. It seems like at this point it might be helpful for me to place the problem of inequality in the context of a competing good, so that we're not just thinking that, well, there's this problem, it's inequality, and we can do anything to fix it. Obviously, the competing good is economic freedom, and which seems to me a very significant good for two reasons. One is, I think actually economic freedom comes close to being intrinsically good, that we are left free to be able to invest our energies in ways that can create wealth. But I also know, in part from studies from AEI, that economic freedom has been a principal factor in lifting people out of poverty. I said we weren't going to talk about poverty, but we can bring it up. In lifting people out of poverty around the world, that there are correlations between economic freedom indexes and countries becoming wealthier. So out of simple, it's what I want to say is it's totally possible to care deeply about the problem of inequality, or about the problem of poverty, and to support economic freedom. Do both of you acknowledge that to be a very important good, or would you dispute anything that I've said about it?
Well, I would just say that it's not, so we can get a misleading picture if we say it's a competing good. I would say that these are sort of orthogonal to each other. And some things that will expand economic freedom will reduce economic inequality, and some things will expand it. And some things that add to average wealth will expand inequality, and some of them will reduce it. So for example, the expansion of global trade has arguably and probably, I think, increased economic inequality within this country, but has probably substantially reduced inequality globally, because for the reason you said, because extreme global poverty has fallen so much as a result of it.
David, do you acknowledge that yeah, go ahead.
Well, so to me, I think freedom is certainly a value that we should hold dear. A little bit like Ramesh, though, I'm not, the relationship between freedom and inequality, I think, is not necessarily direct or clear. And that's sort of for a couple of reasons. So one is the sort of the idea of what we look around the world. You mentioned sort of these indexes of economic freedom, or even broader. There's some other, often conservative groups like Heritage or Cato and others have freedom indexes. They often tend to be the highest in the sort of social democratic countries, the Nordic countries. So freedom can mean a lot of different things. And then even on that sort of, my fear is freedom often means freedom for those who are wealthy. And that's because it's taken as a negative kind of conception that as long as government doesn't tell me what to do, as long as I can do whatever I want, things are good. Well, that's true when you have all the power and can do all the things you want, and you can make life, miserable for other people because you have power over them. And so to me, a richer conception of freedom is a positive freedom, the ability to actually do things on your own, the actual ability to make choices, to have enough income so that you aren't dependent upon government or the whims of your employer, so you can actually negotiate with your employer. So I guess it's a positive good. It sometimes can be related to inequality. Sometimes it's unrelated to inequality.
Okay, let me.
Can I just add one other thing?
Please,
just because
please do.
One thing that I think people sometimes trip over is that it does not logically follow from economic freedom being a good in itself that it can't justly or reasonably be limited, right? Government can limit or shape our economic freedom while recognizing it as a good in itself. And sometimes it's like a year or two ago, Tucker Carlson on Fox News got a lot of attention when he said freedom is like a toaster or a stapler. It's a tool. Oh no, it's not just a tool, because we do in fact value the fact that people can choose their own occupation, for example.
Yes.
And we don't value it simply because it produces more wealth, but that doesn't mean we'd say you have the perfect right to become a hitman.
That's good. It's nice that you use the word right. I find sometimes some of my students want to think about freedom in absolute terms, that if there's a freedom, then it's an absolute freedom. They don't realize that freedoms have to be attenuated for numerous reasons. And this is especially problematic when that freedom gets a kind of hard casing around it, and we call it a right. Then we have clashing rights that, if everybody insists on their rights absolutely, then we really can't engage in political deliberation in a way that would be prudential and good for the country. We talked about other countries briefly, David. You mentioned the Nordic countries, and I wanted to go there for a minute because you did underscore one of the really remarkable features of those countries, and they're often pointed to, as you well know, as examples by people today who call themselves democratic socialists or socialists of one kind or another. They frequently point to that model. One of the interesting things about those countries that you did just underscore is that on the productive side, as opposed to the distributive side of the equation, they're remarkably free markets. I think they register higher on, I think you just said, they register higher on a lot of these indexes than the United States measures. And this seems to me really important because it helps us as we turn in a minute to start thinking about ways we can address inequality if we wish to address it. One of the things I think we've learned from those countries, and that we continue to learn from people who are prominent socialist writers today, is how important markets are. That the socialists today are not proposing we do away with markets and that we use central planning to remedy these problems, but rather there are certain things that only markets do as well as they do. And so I would say, looking at different countries around the world, are there countries that either of you think, how does America compare in terms of inequality to countries around the world? I'm going to attempt to forestall one answer, but you don't have to give me this. But I'll forestall it perhaps by saying, you might point to the Nordic countries and say they have less inequality, therefore, right, we should do what they're doing. But actually, it doesn't seem to me to be their model in particular that is lifting people out of poverty around the world. That seems to be a model that presupposes an awful lot that may be unique to the Nordic countries. But let me just ask, would you both take a minute to think comparatively about inequality? David, we'll start with you.
Sure. I mean, if you're going to compare the United States on levels of inequality, the sort of two major ways of inequality, or Ramesh mentioned the Gini, which is sort of a kind of an overview, or there's the kind of 1%, just sort of how much is the very top getting. And kind of by both of those, the US is an outlier, at least among the rich democracies. It's, the share of income going to the top 1% is about twice as much as most other wealthy democracies. And, our measure of a Gini puts us at places like Saudi Arabia, that, not the typical sort of places we want to be compared to. So we're out there right now. We're not in a good place, and this is where sort of you start to think of, well, what does this mean for us? But most other countries, it's not just the Nordic countries. You can compare us to Germany, to Australia, to even Great Britain, which is sort of our closest on most of these kind of high inequality measures. They're still much better off. So we are. America is different in a lot of ways, and this is one of them, not one of the good ways, in my view.
One of the locutions you used was interesting to me. You're talking about the share that goes to the highest, to the top percent. That seems already to bring in a kind of a normative claim, and I wonder if it's what we're talking about when we're talking about shares. It's almost as if there's a pie in America, and it's called the income pie. And the top percent get more of that pie and the other people don't. But that's not really the way wealth is made or how that works in any country. There's no pie. Rather, work and industry and ideas and innovation produce wealth, and wealth produces wealth, as of course through investment. When you talk about a share of the percentage getting income, is that a concept you'll defend philosophically, or is that more rhetorical?
It's a concept I'll defend because there's data on it. That's the most important thing. Most countries have tax systems, and that's why we have tax records. That's how we can measure the share going to the top 1% over a lot of time and compare it to countries. I also think it is quite revealing because while what you mentioned is true, that the economy it's not just that one person gets something and someone else doesn't. There are mutual gains from trade. We can all sort of do better off, but that is not always or even that often what happens. Oftentimes there's at least also a competition for a larger share of the pie as well. And so that sometimes one person's getting it is actually at the expense of others. And so it's not purely that way, but it's at least a ballpark approximation of what is going on in the economy. It's one measure, and we have it for lots of countries.
Did you want to weigh in, Ramesh?
So when I think about international comparisons, first of all, depending on the issue, one has to be somewhat careful because sometimes there are measurement differences. Different countries measure these things differently. I think it is true that the U.S. Tends to have more economic inequality. I also think, though, that one of the points that both of our Davids here have made in different ways is also true, which is that how redistributive a government is, how much it tries to affect inequality through taxes and spending, is in some ways less important than what kinds of regulation it has, how much regulation it has. So a lot of those Nordic countries tend to be pretty open to trade, tend to have pretty light regulations. Their redistribution takes the form of universal spending benefits that are financed largely by high levels of taxation on nearly everybody, as opposed to steeply progressive taxes that single out the highest earners. In fact, they tend not to be all that different from the US in terms of the top tax rate or in terms of the corporate tax rate. And all of these things, they have different implications for economic growth. So those are a couple of things I keep in mind when I do these international comparisons. And then the other one is just, I also think that any international comparison, you have to keep in mind that different countries have different histories and trajectories, and what works in one country might not work in another, or might not be feasible as a reform to another country. So for example, and I don't want to sort of hijack this into a discussion of healthcare, as important as healthcare is, but if you're Britain and you've socialized your healthcare system, when your healthcare system is a much, much smaller portion of your economy, as in post-World War II, that just creates a totally different set of issues than if we were to try to move to that kind of model in our extraordinarily extensive and highly capitalized healthcare system.
That's helpful. It's very helpful. Right before I go to the next question about things that might be done about inequality, I just want to go back to this quick exchange that David and I had, because it seems like what we were saying, we were both touching on without fully identifying it, sort of caricatures that I've heard from both the left and the right. I think they're caricatures anyway. One, or let me just say, sort of extreme views that are too extreme to be, I think, too very explanatory. One extreme view, let me start with the left, which is the view that it is a zero-sum game. That if some people are wealthy, it's because other people are not, and that they have their gains at the expense of others. And you're defending the claim that there must be some of that. The harder thing to know is how much of that there is. On the other side, you'll hear, and this argument goes all the way back to Locke's second treatise, and probably earlier. Locke has that famous line that the day laborer in England is better dressed and fed than a king in America, and he means Native America at the time when he's writing the 1700s. The way we describe that now is a rising tide lifts all boats. That everybody's going to be better off in an economy that has economic freedom than they would be in any other economy. It seems to me somewhere between those two extreme descriptions is the messy truth that's hard to get at, because it's very hard, I think, to measure the validity of those two pictures. That's a statement that I would like you to
well put. Well put. I mean, I think that is, if we could have this kind of a debate elsewhere, I think that would be a really constructive, because, as you sort of highlighted there, the left has increasingly had to recognize the power and importance of markets. I think most of it did, but the far left, was sort of rejecting the value of markets as sort of both a bastion of freedom, but also as incredibly productive. On the right, I feel like they have taken that to a fetishization and not recognized that actually there are plenty of things that there's plenty of market failures. Markets get too concentrated, you don't have competition, or they have externalities that don't lead to things that most of the public actually wants. And so some level of bounded market competition is the goal. Now, we can have a debate about how much bounds and what kind of things. We don't want the losers in the market competition to not be able to eat. We don't want necessarily the winners in the market competition to then consolidate and own everything and then prevent any competitors from challenging them in the future. So yeah, that middle ground, and I would like to think that we could and should be there. My view is that we have not, in part, we're coming to an interesting debate, but I think the market fetishization was among both parties for the past 30, 40 years, and the Democrats are sort of much more questioning that, and then the Republicans in their own way are questioning it, but not necessarily at the elite level in the way, or at least among most of the electeds in the way, but I feel like there is the beginning of a real potential for a conversation in the way there has not been in a long time.
So I think that it's certainly true that there are market failures. But I do also think that we have a lot of problems, including problems that make inequality bigger, that result from a failure to have markets. So, for example, or to have markets that are as free as they could. I think restrictions on the supply of housing in some of the fastest growing parts of the country have been a very big problem in terms of constricting economic opportunity, making mobility, geographic as well as economic mobility, much lower than it should otherwise be. I think that occupational licensure is another one where, sort of in the 1950s, something like 5% of all jobs required a government license before you could do them. And as of the mid 2000s, it was closer to about a third of all jobs require it. And you can see how some of those licensing requirements have reduced the opportunity to climb the ladder of economic success. And you can also see, I think, how some of those restrictions have allowed people at the high end to extract rents, not market gains, but I think, for example, we allow the supply of doctors in this country to be limited more than we should, and we make some things that nurses could do, something that only doctors can legally do, in a way that tends to heighten their income. A lot of the 1%, the top 1%, are doctors. Nothing against doctors. Lots of people in my families are doctors. But I think that there are any number of reforms that we could take that are liberalizing reforms, that are pro-free market reforms, that would tend to reduce poverty, increase opportunity, and also, although again, it's not my highest priority, reduce inequality.
Okay, thank you. Let's talk about potential policy moves here, and I'm going to put it in a sort of concise way, and then I'll just draw it out a little bit. Can economic inequality be reduced in a way that is effective, just, and avoids undesirable consequences? That's obviously the hard question. I've thought about it a little bit, nowhere near as much as you have, I'm sure, but it seems to me that one way to divide up the possibilities here is to think about trying to address inequality before it happens. So these would be like anterior as opposed to posterior plans. After it happens, we can talk about welfare, but there are lots of things we can do before it happens, like try to improve education for everybody. I'd like to hear from David first, because I know I've heard David speak on this before. David, what are some of the things that you think are relatively doable that would decrease the gap?
Sure. Well, we can start with education, and I want to, frame out. I think education is, certainly an important piece, but it's often overrated and overstated in sort of its role in leading to people's, ability to have a good job and succeed financially. But so, one of the biggest, easiest fixes that would, I think, meet all of your criteria: universal pre-K. So this would be a huge economic win in lots of ways. So the people who are getting, the quality education do much better in their life. The parents who then don't have to pay for the care, and oftentimes it wasn't that good, are much better. They're able to, participate in the labor market much better. So that's a huge, easy win. I think we can also try to run our economy at full employment a lot more often than we do. And when it's at full employment, wages tend to go up for everyone, and they tend to go up especially for those at the bottom and the middle, at least as much and sometimes more than those at the top. So run full employment. And I can sort of keep going in this vein, but I also want to get, there's also going to be a debate, because to me, there's many other things that, so I don't think Ramesh will disagree with much of what I said so far, but there's plenty of other policies that I will add where he will claim there's a big harm. So I think we should raise taxes on the wealthy. I think we should significantly increase unionization and have much greater amount of collective bargaining, raise the minimum wage. And he'll claim, I think, let him say for himself, he'll claim that these have harms. I think there's a lot of good evidence that they don't have any hindrance or a minimal hindrance on the economy, but lead to much greater gains for most workers.
That's,
and
the harm.
That reduces any.
The harm question is very difficult for me because it seems to me there's the potential for practical harms, and you're imagining some of those that Ramesh will articulate. But there is also the problem of moral harms. And here, David, philosophers like Nozick have spent a lot of time trying to think about what justifies takings. The phrase takings, what justifies taking. And I think it's a very difficult area to think through. I didn't mean to cut you off. I want to hear what else you have to say, but I think you're right to point at the potential of harms, and I just wanted to add the moral dimension.
Yeah, I think the moral dimension, at least how I think about it, is kind of actually back to that positive freedom conception I was sort of thinking about, mentioned earlier, is that you want to maximize the ability of people to actually have free choice of what they do, that someone else is not going to be able to dominate them. And that, in my view, tends to require some limitations on the freedom of those at the very top who have, like, whether they run a business, that you can't just, fire someone for this reason, or you can't pay them as little as you can get away with, that you might want to enable the workers to join together so they can bargain with you together so that they can be closer to a similar power structure. So to me, the moral value that I'm thinking about is maximizing individuals' positive freedom.
Potential to actualize our lives in ways that are meaningful. Ramesh.
So I think that, first of all, David's prediction of what I would say is pretty close to accurate about a number of those proposals. However, I do think that it is important that we also talk about some of the areas of agreement. I do, for example, think David and I probably agree to some extent on sort of high-end macroeconomic policy that, say, like over the last 10 years, I do think that monetary policy has tended to be too constrictive, tended to be too pessimistic about the potential of our economy to run at very high employment levels. And I think that kind of practical agreement, if implemented, would be enormously, enormously helpful. If you think back just in terms of the practical experience we have had over the last 3 or 4 decades, the two periods where we've seen the most positive social trends in terms of poverty, in terms of wages at the low end of the labor market, in terms of unemployment, in terms of labor force participation, all of those things, the late 1990s, and then let's say 2016 to 2019, both of these being periods where we were pretty close to full employment, in part because we had a supportive monetary policy. So we'll disagree on some of these other things. I mean, I am less convinced that universal pre-K is an easy win, for example. The getting a universal high quality pre-K program seems to be much, much less likely than that. I do think, the Congressional Budget Office found that raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour would, if I remember correctly, cause about 1.3 million more people to be jobless than otherwise would be. And while it certainly would increase wages for a lot of people, a lot of those people, no offense to some of our listeners, are teenagers in relatively affluent households who don't need the help as much as some of those 1.3 million people might. So I think, and also I would say that 1.3 million figure was a short-term figure. There's a possibility that the long-run effect on jobs might be worse as businesses change. And then I think there are also better ways of accomplishing some of these goals. So I imagine that David and I agree that in expanding wage subsidies, using what we've got in the earned income tax credit, to make it so that maybe a company doesn't find somebody's labor to be worth, $13, $14 an hour, but maybe there's a social value to that person having the job, going and working, and so the government tops up that wage. that, it seems to me, is something that doesn't have the same potential cost in terms of destroying jobs. And I think if we go down the list of other issues, we're going to find that kind of disagreement based on what we think the effects are and whether we think that there are alternatives that are superior.
David, I'd love to hear you respond to the minimum wage question in particular, because it's one that I'm confused about myself. I mean, I read some economists of ages old past, like von Mises, who's very clear, perhaps too clear, that when you raise minimum wages, that's going to lead to closures or less employment, and that the way you would prevent that is ultimately going to be to coerce people not to do the things that they're naturally going to want to do in response to the higher minimum wage. Would you respond to that?
So yeah, the minimum wage is, at least over the past decade or two, I'd say is about one of the most studied things in labor economics. So we now have tons and tons of research. But about 30 or 40 years ago, I would have said most of the academic economists would have agreed with Ramesh when he said that, if you raise the wage, you're going to have businesses choosing to employ less workers, based on basically my view of an oversimplified understanding of the way the economy works, and also a devaluing of what humans are. This was sort of a theory that humans are like widgets. You raise the cost, you're going to get less of them. Raise the price, but humans, when you pay them more, you have a whole bunch of other things that actually happen. The worker is more attached to the job. They tend to stay there, and there's less turnover. So that actually reduces the cost of it. You also have the worker is also a consumer. They go out and buy things, which stimulates demand and leads to additional businesses wanting to hire workers. You also have the ability for businesses to reorganize the way their firm is operated and become more productive. And in fact, they often do that. They can also raise prices. And so there's been a whole lot of research, because now over the past decade or two, we've had a lot of cities and states that have raised minimum wages while other nearby places haven't. And so there's been a huge literature. And I would say the majority, but by no means all of it, but the majority finds that the sort of center of that most of the time there's minimal to no employment effects. And even when they're looking at the places where they think it really should bite, like they're just look at restaurant employment or just look at teens, and all of them, this is pretty universal. Even the CBO figure that Ramesh is citing finds that the workers are unambiguously better off, and that vast majority of people who are impacted by the minimum wage are from low income households. Yes, there are a few at the top, but the vast majority are low income people, and that many of them are 30-year-old adults people. So I think we have both a theory and an empirical revolution that is changing the way a lot of economists think. Doesn't mean it's changed the way conservatives or liberals will debate this issue, but it's certainly, I think, been part of how the public is perceiving it. Now, minimum wage has often been popular, but it is now one of the more and more popular, even in quite conservative places past, Florida, or it's something the public generally supports. It's also, I think, not just an economic question, it's a moral value question of should work pay? And are we making a statement that if someone's working full time, we don't want them to be in poverty, and we don't want them to be dependent upon government. We think that hard work should pay enough to be a full member of our society.
Let me raise the federalism question, because I was thinking about different states doing different things and realizing that that the economies of different states are quite different, and to have a fixed minimum wage policy might be, Nietzsche talks about philosophizing with a hammer. Maybe we're doing economics with a hammer. And so one of the questions I wanted to bring up is, are we doing things in the least invasive way possible when we're trying to address inequality? And is it worth remembering federalism and giving more power to states to set policies in their own way on these issues? I want to ask that. I also want to say to the audience, we've got about 175 people watching, and we're rounding the corner into the last 10 minutes of this talk. And I would really love to have some questions from the audience. So there's a Q&A feature on Zoom that you have access to, and please think about some questions that you'd like to put to the panelists, and my team will sort through the questions and try to take as many as we can in the last part of the talk. I'll turn to that at 9 o'clock Eastern time. Yeah, so federalism and trying to do things with the least, you know, the least chance of unlikely consequences and undesired consequences.
So on the federalism question, I think that if you're going to have a federal minimum wage, and we've had one for 80, 90 years now, then what makes the most sense is a federal floor with the ability of states to set a minimum above that level. That's the system we have. And then it just becomes a question of sort of what that level should be, right? And I tend to think that, you know, as I said, raising $15 would have some costs that I think are higher than what David suggests, and that there are alternative methods of getting the benefit. So I would prefer to leave that federal minimum wage in place, or at least raise it to a lower level than $15 an hour, while allowing states to set higher minimum wages. Understanding, as you rightly note, that different states, different economies are going to have vastly different effects from that higher minimum wage. If your cost of living, if your entire cost structure is a much lower one in your state, it's more likely to have the negative effects than if it is not.
David?
Yeah, and I actually mostly agree with what Ramesh said, which is really nice. Like, I think the minimum wage. Right? Well, but yeah, minimum wage is also, to me, in some ways a model policy of what I would consider progressive federalism, that the federal government is setting a floor and the states can go above that. They can't go below it. That's not, so it is, you know, it's not pure federalism that states can do whatever they want, but so I ultimately like that kind of policy. You know, I'm sure there are opposite examples of what I'm going to provide, but one of the more interesting things I find is actually a lot of the conservative states have prevented their cities from raising the minimum wage, which is not exactly federal. It's a related concept that the city, what's happening in Jacksonville and Miami is different than what's happening in the rest of the state, and so that could or should they have the ability to raise their minimum wage or do other kinds of policies, and oftentimes they are not allowed to because the state government has told them so, even though, you know, in theory, the conservative places should want more local government at the localist level, and we see less of that. As I said, I'm sure, you know, you can criticize, there'll be plenty of opportunity to criticize us for saying the federal government and we're preventing the cities or states from doing the thing. But when it comes to policies that tend to regulate the market, I find the conservative states don't let their cities do a lot, and that's sort of the opposite of what, if they're, you know, which value are they holding more dear, and they're not holding that sort of appreciation for local government very dear there.
And David, I have a question for you. I'm not going to pretend it's a question for Ramesh. It's mostly aimed at you, and that is, you know, at the beginning of the conversation, we were talking about consequences that help us understand why inequality is a problem. It's a problem because of certain consequences that it brings about with it. Can you think out loud about gauging, how can we want to therefore gauge these reform efforts pretty carefully so that they address the problems directly that we're worried about? And so can you set sort of concrete goals or concrete ideas in place for where we would ideally be? So, for example, if we're worried that inequality cashes out into differences of political power, I think the way you said it was it deeply affects our democracy. Where do we need to see the inequality gap so that that's not possible? Or rather, it might be possible to attend to that problem in different ways on the regulatory side, perhaps. But if you're also talking about positive freedom and the actualization of human virtues and human abilities, where do we need to be for you to be satisfied that that's at a good level?
Yeah, I think that's a tough and almost unanswerable question, and that means it's a good question because there's no the answer is going to show there's clear limits to sort of my line of thinking. We can poke holes, but to say here is the best level of inequality, although we could flip the question and, I don't think Ramesh will say here's the best level of inequality either. It's, to me, some level of inequality is inherently fine and maybe even good in that it provides some incentives for work or effort or reflects differences amongst people. But what is clear to me is we are at a level where we're seeing the kinds of problems in democracy that philosophers have been worried about for centuries. Even the founders of the United States were deeply, deeply worried about this question. James Madison, he was worried that inequality was the source of factions, which he hated, like basically the partisan fighting. So what level do we see? But we can see that the moments in U.S. history when we've had our highest levels of inequality have been when we have had the worst government. It's sort of pretty clear in my view. So we look at the pre-Civil War South, just at the South. This was about the most unequal society we've ever had. And of course, their treatment of slaves was abominable and, beyond moral comparison. But even how they dealt with the slave owners controlled the political system, and how they dealt with free whites is they basically rigged the system because they didn't want their slaves taxed, even though basically all the freemen wanted were taxes to pay for roads and schools. And so we had a totally captured political system then. Similarly, when in the Gilded Age, when we had another period of rising and very high inequality, so much so that the president of the time, Rutherford B. Hayes, said, this is no longer a government of the people, for the people, by the people. It's a government of the business, by the business, for the business. And today, I think it's also clear, the social science studies show that some of the best research to me looks at sort of what polls of what the public wants. And they show that what the public wants in terms of policy rarely, if ever, happens. The times when it happens is when the rich want the same thing. When the rich want something different than what the poor or the middle class want, the rich get their wish. And so much so that the basic research seems to show that the government is no longer responsive to the will of the people in far too many cases. And so these are big, big problems we can see now and at points in our past when we've had extreme levels of inequality. At what point do we cross it? I don't know. I think it's both a threshold and it continues to get worse.
Ramesh, I'm happy to hear from you if you wanted to say anything.
Yeah, so I'll just make 2 points. One, so if you compare, say, the 1950s with the late 1990s, no question that the late 1990s is a less egalitarian society economically, but it's a better governed society. It's a society in which a much larger proportion of the population is enabled to vote, in which there's much broader civil liberties than there were. So I don't believe this correlation. And the other thing is that when we think about the sources of strife and a lack of solidarity in our society, about the divisions, our failure to see ourselves as part of the same society, it seems to me that the fundamental dividing lines here are not primarily rich versus poor, that it's much, much more red versus blue that is the fault line, and a very rich liberal and a very rich conservative in our country they've become people who really fight each other with people who make less money than them on both sides as their allies, and that we don't have really a kind of the typical class politics that we might worry about in terms of inequality.
That's insightful. And it sets me up for the last question, just a quick reflection from each of you. I'm curious if you foresee a greater consensus in the future, in the near future, perhaps, in American politics on economic matters across the aisle, the right-left divide, or do you see this the same level of disagreement as always, or perhaps things are getting worse. And I would cite, like, once again, the fact that, I mean, I'm hopeful that we can find greater consensus, and part of it is exemplified in this conversation, and part of it is economic science. David's talking about studies that bear things out. We learn more about the economy, and we can point to facts and data and discuss things concretely. But I guess I'm an eternal optimist, but I'd like to hear from both of you if you see how you see the future on economic inequality and the policy side of it.
Well, so it seems to me that both parties are in flux. Both of our large political coalitions are in flux on these issues in a way that makes this future a little less predictable. So on the Republican side, on the conservative side, there's this increasing sense of the party now including a lot more working class voters and needing to have a different economic agenda to address that. And sometimes that takes the form of trade protectionism and restrictions on immigration. Sometimes it takes the form of not cutting entitlement spending, Social Security and Medicare. Sometimes it takes the form of let's try to find a way to expand family leave. On the Democratic side, I think you've sort of got the opposite thing going on, which is this increasingly affluent, college-educated suburban constituency that has been moving to the Democratic Party and is in some ways affecting the priorities, including the economic policy priorities of the Democratic Party. And so they may end up going in a different direction, but it's just possible that this will happen in a way that creates some common ground and some ability to reach that kind of consensus. But it just seems to me that it is a moment that is let's just say it's pregnant with possibilities.
Okay. David, did you want to say anything?
And no, I agree. I actually agree on the sort of partisan, coalition that's changing and interesting, which makes this an interesting and hard to predict time for sort of where economics will go. So what I would add to what Ramesh says, and this makes me both optimistic and pessimistic, is my optimism is amongst the general public. There's fairly broad support for, I think most of the things I've been talking about, the public, higher minimum wage, more paid leave, generally those kinds of policies, the public is, somewhere on, sometimes up to 60% plus supportive. Now, whether that's going to translate in, and that's across both parties. People in both parties tend to support these things. Whether that's going to translate into actual legislation, I think, is a much bigger and more difficult question. And I think, that some of that is about partisanship, that neither side wants to, we're polarized and neither side wants to deal much with the others. But the other part, as I think about this is, and so that's the negative, the more optimistic side on the elite side is the ideology, I think, is shifting a little bit. As I mentioned, my view is sort of for the past 30, 40 years, the Republican philosophy of trickle-down, economics, where these kind of policies were seen as not good or harmful, was adopted by at least a significant amount of the Democratic Party. And so there wasn't, but that philosophy is shifting, and understanding of actually how the economy works. And I especially think that the Great Recession, 2007, the financial collapse, as well as the data on, stagnant wages for the past 40 years. And I think the fear of our country having great political strife, which it is certainly not directly about economics, as Ramesh was saying, the partisanship, race, class, immigration, but the economics are clearly intertwined with those issues. The feeling of being left behind and others benefiting at people's expenses are clearly also what's happening. And so I think the economics are shaping the politics, which is then shaping actually how the sort of received ideology that people are comfortable with, what I can keep doing, I can cut taxes on the wealthy. Things are changing now, and it's a moment where anything could happen, and that could be very good or very bad.
Thank you. These have been really great comments, and I'm looking at the chat now, and I'm going to read a couple questions to you all and to you both. one that gets into one that I want to take because it's morally related, and I hear it discussed quite a bit, is the questioner says, on the moral dimension, and I'd love it if Ramesh would start on this one. On the moral dimension, how do we address the compensation of the very top business people? What is the value added, truly, that justifies the salary, including stock compensation that they receive? Now,
yeah. So what I would say there, by no means having studied this in any detail, is that maybe there's a market failure there, but it certainly seems as though the market for CEOs is dominated by people who are careful about their money and sophisticated about money, and they think that you need to have this sort of compensation in order to get the best CEO, and to get the highest performing CEO makes a great deal of difference in these extraordinarily large and complex organizations in terms of getting the most profits, getting the most efficient deployment of resources. Now, it may be that in some respects there are distortionary factors. So, 30 years ago, the conventional wisdom in Washington was that we needed to encourage stock options because they would better align companies or CEOs' incentives with their company's interests. And so they fiddled with the tax treatment of stock options versus wages in a way that encouraged that for high earners. Maybe that was a mistake. But in general, I'm not convinced that CEO pay is excessive, or that the CEOs aren't producing value for the people who give them the money.
Obviously we're going to disagree on this one. I basically take the point of the question. I think it's pretty hard to morally justify, the increase of salaries that most CEOs have had. The typical CEO used to make about 20 times in the 70s, 20 times what the typical worker made. Today, it's over 300 times in the U.S. And also, when you compare pay of CEOs in the U.S. to most other countries, we're well beyond them. It's this is a power question. CEOs have the power to get it. They get it. It doesn't mean that they're morally worthy, or even that that's economically, beneficial. In fact, much of the research shows that it leads them to take great risks. They become focused on the short term because they're focused on their immediate compensation, the stock, stuff Ramesh was alluding to, and it actually leads to worse longer term results. So it's, morally dubious, and it's also economically, I think, questionable.
That's a really interesting disagreement. With such clear boundaries. I mean, Ramesh is emphasizing the market, and you're emphasizing power. And I'm sure that, and Ramesh admitted actually that, are there market failures? Sure, possibly yes. But that's actually, I understand this disagreement to be a prudential judgment about what's going on in the background. And that's really speculation. And that's probably why we disagree on that.
Would I, if you don't mind my just tossing in and getting a second bite of the apple here, I do think that there's maybe another issue that's in the background here, and that is how we view mid-20th century America. Sort of America from the 30s to the 70s in some ways is a kind of template that a lot of us, right, left, center, carry around, even if we weren't there to live through it, as kind of normal. And it wasn't normal. Not only was it more egalitarian than what happened before or than what has come since, it was more conformist, it was more centralized, it was more dominated by large institutions like big business and big government and big labor and big media. So I think that's part of the reason you had more compression between CEO and worker pay was because it was this extraordinarily unusual period of history marked by the Great Depression and the incredible mass mobilization of World War II and the long after effects of those things.
Mm-hmm. Good. One audience member wants us to say more about the difference between income inequality and wealth inequality. And since he or she is asking that, why don't I throw in the possibility that we might reflect a little bit on inheritance, which seems such a tricky question for me, because on the one hand, it seems unjust to pass something to your children that they get it and other people didn't. On the other hand, I sometimes think, but shouldn't we be free to give people? What if I just gave a homeless person out here $2 million? Why is that fair to other homeless people, right? So there's the tension between the freedom to bestow and the question of justice of the recipient. But but before we start talking about inheritance, yeah, what's the difference between wealth inequality and income inequality?
I'll start, I guess. So,
sure.
I mean, wealth, just for, basic sort of definitional thing, this is the accumulation of sort of all of your assets, the value of your assets, your stocks, your bonds, your savings accounts, your house, minus your debts. And that's your wealth. The income is just the amount you're earning each day, year. And wealth inequality, as Ramesh mentioned, is much, much, much greater than income inequality. I mean, the scale is the top 1% of wealth holders have more wealth than the bottom 80% combined. But the same basic trends rising over the past 40 years, and we are much, much more concentrated than we've been. The sort of second part of your question on inheritances and how you think about that. I mean, to me, there's the moral question, but there's just also the policy question, which is, I think, why. And so to me, I support an estate tax, which is, it still allows the individual has the choice with how much they give to their kids or grandkids or whatever. But if it's over 10 million bucks, they got to be paying taxes on that. Certainly you can provide a leg up for your kids, and you already have done that throughout their lifetime. But at some level, and what that level is debatable, but 10 million sounds like a reasonably high level that would be, you're not really limiting freedom that much. Seems like the inordinate benefit you are passing on without passing on something else to the rest of society, that society can and should benefit from a large, large gift that you're, giving your heirs.
So let me, first of all, just gesture toward the incredible complexity of this in a way that I think isn't intuitive for people. So, and I'm borrowing this illustration from Lawrence Summers, who's been a fixture of most Democratic administrations in the last several decades. And he points out that if you were to expand Social Security, let's say double Social Security checks for everybody who receives it, the long-term effect of that would be a huge increase in wealth inequality, because people in the middle of the income spectrum and below it would both have less ability, but also less need to save and to accumulate assets for their own retirement. And so the people who still did would be even more lopsidedly at the high end than they are now. Now, he makes this point not to say it would be a bad idea. In fact, he wants, I don't know if you double it, but he wants an expanded Social Security. His point is that, and he thinks that income inequality is a problem too, but his point is that wealth inequality, in his view, isn't as big of a problem. And it's something that is affected by all kinds of things that we don't necessarily think of when we first mention it. On the question of inheritances, my main objection here is that I don't see why we would want to encourage wealthy people to spend all of their money as opposed to saving it and passing it along. Now, if you want to say that we should have high taxes on people who make a lot of money, regardless of whether they are saving it or whether they're spending it, I think that's a different question. But the problem with estate taxes and inheritance taxes is that they don't treat like alike, that they make it a punished thing to save that money and bequeath it. I don't think that is I don't think that is right morally, and I also think that the incentives that it creates are not good. Not to mention that I haven't even mentioned the incredible amount of economic activity that is diverted into estate planning that isn't particularly economically productive just to avoid the tax.
Yeah, David, go ahead.
Can I just add one more thing? Yeah, sorry, thank you. Is that sort of, I didn't really get to this, and this is whether it's a moral value or sort of this is the prudential concern, but I think they're intertwined with sort of the kind of society you want. America was founded as a rejection of aristocracy. And if you are allowing great estates to continue to be passed on in perpetuity, you are creating a more aristocratic society and enabling and saying we're okay with that. And I don't think that is the kind of society we want to be promoting. And, we allow a fair amount of wealth. In fact, as much wealth as you want to pass on, you're just going to be paying taxes on it. So it's a very, as a state, that a very modest way of limiting and addressing, and to even be worried about that as a problem seems really misguided to me.
We could do a whole event on inheritance. It is a very, very tricky thing to think through morally and prudentially. Let me try one more question. Maybe we'll have time for one more after that. A participant wants to know your thoughts on the report that in 2018, 60 Fortune 500 companies avoided all federal income tax. And the audience person cites the example of Amazon year after year pays no federal income tax. Is that just?
I mean, again, I agree with the premise of the question. I think, this is where we have an unequal society, and so those with great wealth and power are able to game the system to their benefit. If they had less wealth and power, they would be less likely to avoid basic things that the rest of us have to comply with. And I think that's one of the deep, deep frustrations here. Yes, it's a reasonable thing to argue, what should the actual tax rate be? Should it be slightly higher or slower? But kind of everyone should be playing on a level playing field and fair and contributing their fair share. And when the people who are doing the absolute best are finding ways, okay, I'm going to call this income in another country, and so I don't have to pay taxes on it, or doing all sorts of shenanigans, I think it is an indication of our political system being captured, that we haven't found a way to actually ensure those at the very, very top. And this is actually when the sort of theoretical political scientists measure and think about oligarchy, is do those at the very, very top have to follow the same rules as everyone else? And we are getting to the point where they don't as much as they should.
I thought oligarchy would come up. There's the word. David and Ramesh, is this questioner saying something that's factually correct that you've heard? I didn't know this, that 60 of these companies pay no federal income tax. Why are they exempt? Go ahead, Ramesh.
So I don't know the exact number. I do remember seeing that report about Amazon, partly because President Trump raised that issue. He does not like Amazon, and he was complaining about it. So we found an area of agreement between David Madland and President Trump. So we have some bipartisanship here. So the answer is different for different companies. I don't know what exactly is the cause of that for Amazon. Sometimes it's because the Congress has decided to reward particular activities with tax breaks, and then the companies use those tax breaks in order to minimize their tax liability. Sometimes it's because of what's called carry forwards, which I don't want to get too far into the weeds, but basically, if you don't make anything between 2017 and 2018, you don't want to pay a huge tax just because of the time pattern of your profits. Just like, if you made a bunch of money on Tuesday and then you don't, and then you make a bunch of losses and it evens out between Tuesday and Wednesday, you don't want to have to pay taxes on those profits. So sometimes there are defensible tax breaks that cause a zero tax liability in some years. Sometimes it's issues that cry out for Congress to change the tax laws.
Good. I think we have time for at least one more. So let me offer you this one. Is there one surmounting piece of advice each of you would submit as we consider a new presidency with a divided Congress and a business community pressing for stability above all else? I'm not sure what kind of advice is being sought here, but.
So I'll give my piece of advice, which is not a specific set of pieces of legislation that should be passed, but an idea of sort of how people should think about it. And that is, given the extraordinary levels of political polarization that we have and the kind of trench warfare we've had over the last really 30 years of American politics, what we need is, I think, some small ball bipartisan agreements that build up the sort of bipartisan muscles that have atrophied over the years. I mean, we've seen that, right? I mean, if you think about some of the pieces of bipartisan progress we've seen in recent years, like the criminal justice reform that passed a couple of years ago, that was possible because crime wasn't the top issue that it was in the US in the 80s and 90s. It was because of a lower salience issue. We need to proactively look for places like that where we can start building up the habit of coming to an agreement and passing legislation.
And so advice, I don't know if I'm giving advice to, but I will take a sort of a prognostication point like Ramesh did. It's a civil debate and discussion like this, if this could occur at a broader level in our political system, would be a huge step forward. I'm skeptical that we will get there. You know, the huge political polarization Ramesh mentioned is sort of one of the key reasons. But there's certainly huge disagreements between the parties, but there are areas of agreement. And there, more importantly, I think, is the public has areas of interest and agreement, things that they want solved, things they don't think are fair or right. And that is what a democracy is supposed to be about, that the will of the people is supposed to be reflected in the policies that the politicians pass. And so my hope, I mean, that is the hope of democracy, is that we are become a more democratic society where the elected officials actually try to do what the public wants and are willing to discuss and debate to achieve that goal.
Yeah, that's great. That's very Baylor in Washington. That's the kind of thing we are striving to cultivate in our small way. I want to thank, I think we should stop now. I see the numbers dropping a bit. And I want to thank both the panelists, Ramesh and David. Thanks so much for a great conversation, for your expertise, but also for your civility and your willingness to think on your feet on these tough questions. We're really, really pleased to have had you join us, and we're grateful.
This was terrific. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.